Good morning or afternoon if for those of you that might be calling in from the U.S. My name is Jopeck, and I'd like to first thank Jakeman Business Solutions for arranging this opportunity for me to talk with you today. I'm pretty excited about the prospect of sharing with you some information and perspectives on security risk management from a U.S. point of view, and looking forward to learning more about your views and perspectives through your questions. First, let me say a few words about SARMA, the organization that I'm representing today. SARMA is a nonprofit professional association that serves those responsible for analyzing and managing security risks to people, system structures, operations, and information, primarily but not exclusively from man-made threats. SARMA's role is to seek to facilitate the further development, standardization, and professionalization of a broadly defined security analysis and risk management discipline. Throughout the presentation, I'll give you information about the profession and people in it, based largely on a survey conducted of SARMA members and associates. I'd also like to ask you to keep in mind that SARMA, as practiced in the U.S., is my frame of reference and what I know best, but please don't interpret my comments there as that the U.S. has the best or the right way or the only way to do these things. It's simply not my place to make that judgment, and even if it were, I'm still learning about the Australian way of applying security risk management, and this is, so from that perspective, I'd like to also communicate that I am representing SARMA today, but the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the U.S. government or SARMA or any past or current employer I might have had, so I'm on my own. Briefly, let me tell you a little bit about myself so you can understand where my opinions and experiences have formed my views on security risk management and the need for an association like SARMA. Over the course of my 25-year history in security, I've had the good fortune to work in security intelligence analysis and risk analysis. The more analytic portion of my career started when I was an analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency and later with the National Security Agency, as well as serving as a counterintelligence analyst with the Counterterrorist Center. Along the way, I developed a methodology and taught a course the U.S. government called Analytic Risk Management, and later a more comprehensive course entitled Continuous Risk Management. After my government employment time, I came to work as a consultant, mostly with federal government agencies with national security missions. Some of the highlights of my assessment career worked with assessing 39 of the nation's largest dams and their associated hydropower plants, leading a risk assessment of the New York City water supply system, numerous government facilities, and developing a variety of university courses on security risk management and training thousands of people in analytic risk management and continuous risk management. After the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, I came to consult almost exclusively with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as that formed, and found that security risk management was a foundational element to its strategy moving forward. So I propose to start today by talking a little about the risk events of concern in security risk management. Assessing the risks of frequently occurring events is pretty easy. As long as data on past events is available, a statistical analysis is going to be helpful in assessing the risks and deciding what to do next. Risk analysis for rare and catastrophic events is a lot more difficult. The absence of historical frequency data generally increases the complexity of the assessment methodology and demands on the analyst. In such cases, as in man-made attacks like terrorism or industrial espionage, we must base our understanding of the frequency of attacks on a combination of intelligence information and security vulnerabilities. I intend to talk today specifically about addressing the risks to these rare and sometimes catastrophic events. So a little bit about history and the development of risk analysis and security risk analysis in the U.S. Going way back, the development of mathematical theory of probability started in the 16th century and created the basis for risk analysis, particularly following the advent of modern probability theory about 75 years ago. Probabilistic risk analysis, which I'll speak about more later, originated in the aerospace industry. One of the earliest comprehensive studies was started in 1967 after a loss of life due to a fire in the Apollo flight AS-204. In 1969, the Space Shuttle Task Group in the Office of Manned Spaceflight of NASA suggested that the probability of the loss of life should be less than 1%. And today, even though most flight programs are unmanned, all components of the space shuttle and space flight go through an independent risk analysis. In nuclear safety, several studies have also focused on reactor safety. The nuclear failure of the reactor core at 3 Mile Island near New York proved that the scenarios anticipated in the study were indeed correct, although the probability of human failures were underestimated by analysts. Not surprisingly, reviews of the 3 Mile Island incident re-emphasized the need for conducting probabilistic risk analysis. Probabilistic risk analysis has since been applied to a variety of natural disasters, including the prediction of earthquakes, floods, and environmental pollution. A large number of studies also focus on waste disposal and environmental health, and even in healthcare, on the probabilistic risk focused on root causes of adverse events such as wrong-side surgery. The application of security to terrorism is a relatively new development. After the decade of the spy and the associated failures in U.S. intelligence and defense security decision-making, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the proliferation of information technologies, the Clinton administration sought to improve security decision-making throughout the defense and intelligence communities. One result was the creation of a U.S. Joint Security Commission, which was chaired by the Director of Central Intelligence and the Assistant Secretary of Defense. Based on the recommendations in the report titled Redefining Government Security, they issued a call for the use of risk management in national security, a process they claimed was already practiced in the defense community under the rubric of operations security. The U.S. Security Policy Board created a training and professional development subcommittee which helped create training in security risk analysis. As a result, the analytic risk management methodology was developed at the CIA. For several years, armed training throughout the intelligence, defense, and federal security and law enforcement communities was conducted for security professionals and managers alike, and I had the good fortune to be, for a time, the lead instructor of that course. Although analytic risk management is still used in several federal agencies, its true legacy was that it was at the start of a trend toward using probabilistic risk analysis across a wide variety of national security concerns, including anti-terrorism, counterintelligence, economic espionage, and numerous other man-made problems addressed in the security disciplines, including physical security, personnel security, information security, technical security, and protective operations. This diagram represents the analytic risk management process, one of the earliest forms in use in the U.S. government. Originally, the analytical risk management, or ARM, approach was used for security events and protection of things like technology, operations, and what's now called supply chain security. At that time, natural hazard risk analysis was considered differently and was not within the realm of the security analysis discipline to consider. Originally, you might notice there was also little consideration of the management framework that today is a common element in most risk management approaches. This diagram here represents just the analysis. After a little trial and error in the real world, the need for a risk management framework to improve decision-making was realized and added. The first methodology addressing this by including a cyclical risk management framework was the methodology I mentioned called continuous risk management. The next large wave of development and evolution in security risk management was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after the attacks of September 11, 2001. The new goal after 9/11, as we call it, was to maximize the protection of the nation in the face of limited resources. There was simply no political willingness to suffer another attack like 9/11. Unfortunately, the list of valued assets and infrastructures in need of protection was very large and continues to grow as we learn more about our society and our infrastructures. Intelligence threat assessments and security vulnerability assessments by themselves were considered inadequate to allow decision makers to make the kinds of decisions necessary to protect the nation. The U.S. government recognized that there are not enough resources to protect everything, and now new risk management-based strategies were needed for allocating resources to enhance homeland security. Thus emerged Homeland Security Risk Management, a conceptual framework for helping decision makers identify their risks and devise risk management strategies that are mindful of the delicate balance between protection and cost. In the years since 9/11, SRM has been increasingly highlighted as the desired approach for helping leadership establish, prioritize, implement, and monitor protection activities. Risk analysis is embodied in a set of 6 distinct questions you see represented here, broken into 2 boxes, the risk analysis and the risk management. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I think this is probably familiar to you, but pretty much all risk management approaches consider what can cause us harm, how likely it is to happen, and how severe it will be if both of those occur. The second set of questions concerns the management of risks that are assessed. What can be done with that risk? What options are available? And what benefit costs and risks? And what are the impacts of these options on future operations? An actionable risk assessment is one that addresses the first 4 questions by providing an assessment of risks and insights into what can be done to reduce risk. The last 2 questions provide a template for appraising the value added of alternative investment options in terms of their affordability, cost effectiveness, extent to which they meet risk reduction objectives, and overall acceptability to the affected stakeholders. There are 2 important questions that must be asked in the course of a risk analysis study. Are the risks acceptable? Only those risks that are unacceptable should be managed. Traditionally, decision makers are the ones responsible for answering this question, not the risk analysts. Some experts would prefer to add a 7th question to this diagram. What level of confidence can be afforded to the final results? Basically, the question asks whether appropriate standards of analytic quality and integrity were applied throughout the process of doing the analysis. While important, this question is typically omitted from the traditional set of 6 because it centers on the quality of the analysis itself and not the actual issues under study. So, borrowing from the definition offered by the Department of Homeland Security, we can define risk as the potential for harm or loss, and I won't read the definition there for you. Traditionally, risk is expressed as the product of the 3 variables: the chances that an attacker will make an attempt at causing harm, we call that the threat; the chances an attacker will succeed in initiating harm, that's a vulnerability; and the impact of that harm, or the consequence. In the security context, there's rarely an identified positive risk, as all such attacks and natural catastrophes are considered negative. There is no public policy incentive to focus on any positive side of these risks. When combined, our judgments of threat, vulnerability, and consequence allow us to rank order different events on the basis of relative risk and provides a stronger basis for making judgments about the overall effectiveness of alternative risk management strategies. The theory behind it, you may have seen this diagram before, it's a popular theoretical visualization of security risk. At the intersection of these 3 circles represents risk. A more common conceptualization for risks arising from non-malicious events includes a set of 2 circles, where one represents consequences from an event and the other represents frequency. Unlike security, where we use likelihood as a proxy for probability and frequency, the word frequency implies that the occurrence can be derived from statistical analysis of past incidents. Let's talk a brief bit about measuring risk at different levels, the way it was viewed by the Department of Homeland Security as it developed its strategy. The initial goal in assessing Homeland Security was to be able to assess risk at the lowest possible level to individual infrastructures and geographic areas using some form of compatible methodologies and common risk scales. The data could then be rolled up, much like the financial metrics of a business, so that at the top level, the federal government could know about the risks in its national portfolio. The needed risk reduction and mitigation efforts could be prioritized and funded through grant programs, regulation, and other voluntary programs. This concept required improvements in risk analysis methods and common risk methods beyond what was available at the time. After Hurricane Katrina, another evolution in security risk management occurred. After Hurricane Katrina, the Department of Homeland Security came to be criticized for focusing too much on terrorism and not enough on natural disasters. Whereas Homeland Security risk management had largely focused on man-made events such as terrorism, a shift occurred to an all-hazard risk analysis. These scenarios are representative, albeit not exhaustive or authoritative, of a listing of all hazard scenarios used in risk assessments. The significance of going to an all hazards approach is that it further increased complexity of merging threats that are intelligence-based and hazards that are historical frequency-based in their risk assessment approaches. A major contributor to risk is ignorance of what can occur. Accordingly, it is important to consider the potential for all plausible imagined events in order to decrease our vulnerability to surprise from attacks that have not yet occurred in the past or are not expected attack vectors of any known group, and therein represents the box called postulated terrorist threats. One of the most challenging problems in assessing risks of different types and different types of scales are the different types of scales that one can use to adequately measure and aggregate the individual components of risk. If inappropriate scales are used for the types of data available, the aggregation of risk may be challenged because some mathematical operations are impermissible with some types of scales. So let me quickly identify the types of scales that are often used in risk analysis. Nominal scales simply attach a name to the value of the variable. Typically, nominal scales are used exclusively for ordered categorization or classification. Ordinal scales are used to place certain quantities in order based on relative magnitude. For example, best to worst, least likely, most likely. The distance between two positions on an ordinal scale, however, has no practical meaning other than one is less than or more than the other. Interval scales are used when the distance between two subsequent values on the scale matter, but are not pegged to a fixed reference point, like 0. While distance has meaning, the ratio of one value to another does not. For example, temperature expressed in degrees Fahrenheit are on an interval scale. The difference between 32 degrees and 31 degrees is the same as the distance between 96 and 95 degrees. However, because interval scales lack a 0 reference point, one cannot say that 96 degrees Fahrenheit is 3 times hotter than 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Ratio scales are used when both the distance and ratios between the scale values matter. Time expressed in any clock unit is also on a ratio scale, as is age, since both cases 0 is a reference point. A natural scale is one that has physical meaning and one that can be measured, at least in principle, using a scientific instrument. Seconds, dollars, and lives are all natural units of measure for disruption of time, economic loss, fatality, and fatality respectively. Natural scales are typically either interval or ratio scales. A constructed scale is one whose meaning was constructed by a human user whose values along the scale each have specific meaning. For example, an ad hoc 1 to 10 scale for expressing psychological impact might be used that contains a qualitative definition of each level option. Typically, constructed scales are ordinal scales. A linear scale is one where the distance between two consecutive levels is the same as any other two consecutive levels on the same scale, while a logarithmic scale is one where the order of magnitude difference between any two consecutive levels is the same as any other two consecutive levels on the same scale. The distance between two consecutive levels is an order of magnitude. For example, 2 equals 100, 3 equals 1,000. So you might want an example of how this really matters in the conduct of performing a risk analysis. So let me give you an example about a dam. I did some work assessing some large dams in the U.S. after 9/11 and had to overcome a lot of ideas about the difficulty or even the practicality of actually anybody trying to destroy a dam. This picture here, just for your reference, is a picture from 1942 after a British Wellington bomber released an explosive device, codenamed the Upkeep bomb, that skipped across a reservoir towards the Möhne Dam in Gunn, Germany. The Upkeep bomb contained almost 6,000 pounds of cast Jopeck explosives and ended up creating a breach in the dam that thoroughly destroyed it and released a good portion of its water. If you needed to assess the risk of catastrophic destruction of a dam like this, you would need to determine the consequences of its destruction or its failure. It's likely you would identify different types of consequences related to the different functions of a dam. Let's explore those consequences and the scales you could use to measure them in more detail. So what would you use to measure dam attack consequences? First and the most obvious is the loss of human lives. As we discussed with our scale discussion, the use of natural and ratio scales would be an easy and logical choice. However, dams have important functions and missions, and the loss of those missions could most easily and almost exclusively be measured on constructed and nominal or ordinal scales. For example, the importance of water supply to manufacturing downstream, agriculture for irrigation, power production, even navigation and flood control would be hard to measure on a natural or a ratio scale. The loss of facility value, replacement value would be easy. The value to recreation and wildlife would be something that would have to be measured on a constructed and nominal scale. And finally, loss of revenue, loss of customer public confidence would be on different scales as well. So what you see represented here is multiple scales that might need to be used on the same risk analysis. Your selection of scales would necessarily impact your options on the formula you use to aggregate, usually through multiplication of the components of risk. This would leave you with three basic approaches for doing this risk analysis. You could measure everything in the most appropriate scale, but accept criticism for using mathematically indefensible operations. You could simply only measure you could only assess the things that you could measure with a natural or ratio scale. You could use a very simple matrix type approach, or you could use a very complex probabilistic risk assessment approach that we had mentioned earlier. Once you've measured the three components of risk, you have to calculate that risk using some form of formula or representation of the risk overall. Risk formulas are how we combine the components of risk. The formula for risk in any particular methodology can take one of a variety of forms. At the simplest level, a heuristic methodology collects a lot of information in support of the analyst making a gut feel about how one risk compares to another and the extent to which one should care. More common in risk management are logical formulas. Logical formulas map qualitative and quantitative statements of the different factors of risk to an overall statement of risk via a series of if-then rules. The most common description of this logic is presented in the form of a risk matrix. Despite its mathematical structure, logical risk formulas are typically referred to as qualitative risk analysis. An arithmetic formula for risk expresses risk as the sum, difference, product, or quotient of a number of factors believed to shape risk. While the factors that comprise such formula may make intuitive sense, such equations often lack the solid theoretical foundation necessary to justify their use. A statistical formula is one derived from statistical analysis of past data. Statistical models are used to make inferences about the future from knowledge of the past. Typically, statistical models are constructed from regression analysis. Statistical formulas are restricted for use only in the context from which they were derived. This means that the same process generating the data must be assumed for the context in which the formula was used. Unfortunately, in security risk analysis, this is often never the case, since times change, new countermeasures are put in place, people move, and attackers adapt and innovate. The variables in statistical formula are typically based on naturally measurable quantities. Now to the probabilistic formula. A probabilistic formula is one that decomposes the logic of a particular situation into a sequence of precursor events or states and employs the mathematics of chance to arrive at an expression that relates the probability of various small events to the probability of a particularly higher level event or outcome. Statistical analysis is also a form of probabilistic reasoning that relies on data from the past to make inferences about the future. Probabilistic analysis, however, does not insist on the use of statistics to work properly. So typically, a probabilistic analysis employs fault tree or an event tree analysis to arrive at an expression of the chances of an event. The variables in a probabilistic formula are most always probabilities, and the values for these variables are often obtained via expert judgment, such as that based on intelligence assessments. The basic concept behind probabilistic risk analysis is reflected in this graphic, depicting a few very basic steps. First, the analyst creates an event tree by characterizing the potential threat using a set of representative scenarios and decomposing the representative scenarios into their component events. Then you quantify the frequency or likelihood of each component event on the event tree. You can then quantify the consequence component for each scenario, calculate risk as the product of frequency and consequence, and analyze your results to identify major sources of risk, as well as the impact of potential mitigation strategies and significant data gaps. This approach underlies some U.S. security risk analysis approaches and is used for the national catastrophic risks like those for chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological attacks. Automating this process, it's possible to calculate risk with every variation and permutation on the preliminary steps of the attack, giving you literally millions of scenarios reflecting a band of uncertainty where the highest and lowest median and the highest, the lowest, and the median and mean of the risks are clearly identified for the decision maker to use in making a decision about an almost infinitely complex threat. So let's shift gears now. I mentioned we would talk a little bit about the security risk profession in the U.S. And you might have questions like, who are security risk analysts and what do they do in the U.S.? How is that different from how we do it here? How do they learn their trade? What methods do they use? How much do they get paid? Pretty much anything. Fortunately, a few years ago, SARMA did a survey in conjunction with a company, SRA International, because we wanted to get more answers about what comprised our profession. So I thought of sharing this with you might be an interesting point of comparison for the US and Australian audiences. Now that we've discussed the security risk analysis in more detail than you probably expected, let's look at the average U.S. security risk management practitioner. 85% of U.S. risk management practitioners are male, and 81.6% are older than 35 years of age, although above that the ages are pretty evenly distributed. More than 50% work for a consulting firm, contractor, or in the private sector or academia, with nearly 60% having more than 20 years of work experience. Approximately 23% claim between 5 and 10 years of security risk management experience, although a similar amount, just under 23%, claim more than 20 years in the field. In terms of background, before becoming risk management professionals, the largest single group, 20%, had a military background. 53% perform risk analysis for either the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security or the U.S. Department of Defense. And 53% have a U.S. government top secret clearance or higher. Fully 86% have responsibilities in their organizations other than risk management, such as project management, program management, general management, or business development. And as you can see there, the salary is quite varied, ranging largely from $100,000 a year to a few making above $200,000 a year US dollars. SARMA has been very interested in the educational profile and the educational development of the profession. So we asked a few questions here and determined that at least 57% have a master's degree or higher. Sadly, for such an important profession, we found that most have acquired their skills in security risk management through self-learning and on-the-job training. More than half have a certification in something, but lacking a certification in security risk management specifically. These listed are the most relevant and commonly held certifications. The OPSEC certified professional is a certification from the OPSEC Professional Society that I may have mentioned earlier, Certified Protection Professional from the American Society for Industrial Security, and Program Management Professional, probably everyone is familiar with. So we were also curious, SARMA is aware of some 180 or so named vulnerability, threat, and risk analysis methods and techniques. So we asked participants in the survey which ones they used most. The answers were highly dispersed, with some of those leading defense and intelligence community methods rising to the top. You might note that few of these methods are those that correspond to those listed in the back, the 30-something listed in the back of the ISO 31000 standard. So when we started SARMA, we first sought to identify what problems were out there in the community that we thought we needed to address in order for this profession, which is very much emerging, to progress in a more professional and compatible manner. Since that time, some of these challenges have indeed been addressed and significant progress is being made. On others, much more work remains to be done. For example, SARMA and DHS have both launched common lexicon projects, and coupled with risk definitions in the ISO 31000 standard, I believe this is the use of incongruous risk management terminology is one of those areas that we're nearly ready to declare accomplished. Standards and generally accepted risk assessment principles is another. While there's some progress in this area, more implementation of standards like ISO 31000 and more documentation and consensus building around generally accepted risk assessment principles is still required. When we first started, it was a very fragmented and competitive community of practitioners. Most professionals didn't know each other, and there were few places where people could get together and collaborate, share ideas and views, and work together to improve the state of the profession. Really feel like that has changed a lot thanks to SARMA and its annual conferences and other events. Increasingly now, we need to work on defragmenting U.S. professionals from their counterparts in other countries, like Australia. The leadership and interagency coordination remains a major obstacle to success. SARMA has and will continue to work with the U.S. leaders to solve some of these tough problems, but it's not a problem entirely within our purview to affect. The absence of common methods of quantification is increasingly, I think we're arriving at the point where there are probably few new quantification methods likely to be found, and it's probably time we began documenting these methods for use in one comprehensive reference available to the profession. With regard to training and certification, recently some new training has been developed. However, there's still not a significant investment on the part of the U.S. government in training its risk professionals and executive decision makers in risk management. Likewise, there's still not a certification program for professionals in this field, although this is something SARMA is working on. So one of the questions coming over here was to compare and contrast a little of how the U.S. approach has worked with in relation to the Australian approach for security risk management. And one of those central topics in that area was the use of ISO 31000 standard for risk management. The U.S. government does not use that very much, and I believe personally that it would benefit from it. It's often said that because ISO 31000 was sort of not invented here, that the U.S. government doesn't implement the standard. But I think the reality is a bit more complex than that. As a practical matter, ISO 31000 has not been mandated by U.S. national leadership. Moreover, as a voluntary rather than a compliance standard, I would question what benefits of implementing it would be in the public sector, and would the return be worth the investment for implementing and maintaining such a framework. But the reality is that in its current state, ISO 31000 does not mesh perfectly well with the legacy U.S. risk analysis methods. More work would need to be done to synchronize them and smooth out some of the rough edges to be more palatable to the U.S. audience. Additionally, risk management in the context of rare and possibly catastrophic events requires establishing the context, and with it the accountability for determining an acceptable level of risk. This is difficult, if not an unnatural act for individuals in the public service. With consequences well beyond their authority, there's little incentive for a public servant to risk their entire career and future on accepting risk that is so difficult to assess and manage. From a SARMA perspective, ISO 31000 is an excellent framework and one that would benefit most users of security risk management. While we don't have a formal policy or statement endorsing it, we may look at that in the future. So what next? So you might be asking, what's SARMA's interest in Australia, and what can SARMA and the U.S. approach to security risk management do to benefit Australian risk professionals and government officials? Well, we're asking the same questions, and my trip here this week is part of that process. One idea being discussed is a survey of Australian risk management professionals to determine their needs and interests. If interest exists, SARMA is considering creating an international SARMA chapter, with Australia being the first candidate. If you're interested in this or you have comments, please use the webinar chat feature now, and I will answer your questions shortly after the end of the webinar. Finally, I'd like to invite you, Australia chapter or not, to join SARMA through our website and also to join our free group on LinkedIn. There are some 1,300 attendees in our main group, including many Australians and risk professionals from almost every other country in the world. There's also a SARMA international group you're welcome to use, a SARMA training and education group, and a SARMA cybersecurity group that you're welcome to join if those are your interests. If you're wondering if you should join SARMA and what you'll get out of it, here's a little bit of the benefits from an individual perspective. It shows a personal commitment to the profession and provides access to information and opportunities that increase career opportunities and value to employers. One thing I like most about it is it promotes collaboration and information sharing of new techniques and best practices, and it provides numerous social, networking, and educational opportunities. Corporations are also welcome to attend as sponsors. Corporations get to demonstrate an active commitment to the highest level of competency in the risk management field and helping the government solve its problems, and in private industry as well. It enables participation and influence with all levels of government in shaping the risk management profession of the future, and it provides numerous business development, networking, and recruiting opportunities. So that concludes the formal remarks of my presentation, and I thank you for your attendance.